In October of 2017, a school trip to Grand Teton National Park turned into a nightmare. 18-year-old Claire Mitchell and her history teacher Michael Cooper disappeared into the wilderness without a trace. For long months had passed. There was no hope until two construction surveyors working in a remote, nearly inaccessible section of the mountains stumbled upon something that didn't belong. A concealed metal hatch half-buried beneath years of dirt and fallen timber. What they found inside shocked even the most experienced rescue teams. In the cold, underground darkness, Claire was sitting on a filthy mattress. She looked like a living ghost, emaciated and pale, her right ankle bound by a heavy industrial chain bolted directly into the concrete floor. But where was the teacher all this time? Had he kidnapped her and run away? Or what really happened? You will find out in this video. Enjoy the video. Before we dive into today's vanished story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe to Seek Stories for more mysterious disappearance cases. On October 15, 2017, a crisp Monday morning, a yellow charter bus carrying the senior class of Jackson Hole High School pulled into the visitor center parking lot at Grand Teton National Park. It was a planned 3-day educational trip, part of an advanced environmental science and regional history course. The route had been approved 6 weeks in advance, and the weather forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures. The group of 24 students was led by 42-year-old history teacher Michael Cooper. His personnel file described him as thorough, patient, and passionate about the natural history of Wyoming. He'd been teaching at Jackson Hole High for nearly 15 years and had led this same trip 7 times before without incident. Accompanying him was a teaching assistant from the school district. Among the students was 18-year-old Claire Mitchell, a reserved girl who, according to her classmates, preferred reading alone during lunch to joining the usual social circles. Her teachers noted she was bright, thoughtful, and often stayed after class to ask questions about the material. At approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, the group set out on the Jenny Lake Loop Trail. This is a moderately challenging route that winds along the shoreline, climbs through dense lodgepole pine forest, and offers stunning views of the Teton Range. According to statements later given by students and documented in the official police report, the mood was light. Michael Cooper walked near the front of the line, periodically stopping to point out geological features and wildlife tracks. He reminded students to stay together and keep the person in front of them in sight. At around 2:30, the group reached a steep section where the trail narrowed and climbed sharply over exposed rock. This was where the line of students began to stretch out. According to 2 witnesses, Claire Mitchell slowed her pace. One student said she stopped to adjust the strap on her backpack. Another claimed she paused to take a photo of the mountain vista through a gap in the trees. Either way, she was only about 30 yards behind the rest of the group. When the teaching assistant noticed Claire was missing, she immediately informed Mr. Cooper. He told the group to stop at a marked trail junction just ahead and wait. His exact words, as recalled by multiple students, were, "Stay right here. Don't move. I'll go back and get her." He turned and walked back down the trail, disappearing around a bend thick with brush and scattered boulders. That was the last time anyone saw Michael Cooper or Claire Mitchell. The group waited 15 minutes, then 20. When 30 minutes passed and the teacher still hadn't returned, the assistant tried calling his cell phone. The call connected, but no one answered. She tried again. This time, the call went straight to voicemail. The terrain in this part of the Tetons was notorious for poor reception, with deep valleys and steep ridges creating dead zones where signals simply vanished. At 3:45, realizing the situation was becoming serious, the assistant made the decision to lead the students back to the trailhead and contact park authorities. The first ranger response team arrived at 4:30. There was less than 2 hours of daylight remaining. Rangers hiked quickly to the section of trail where Mr. Cooper was last seen, calling out names and scanning the surrounding forest. They found nothing. No response. No movement. As dusk settled over the mountains and temperatures dropped into the low 40s, the decision was made to suspend the search until morning. A full-scale search operation launched the next day, October 16th. More than 60 volunteers, professional search and rescue personnel, dog teams, and a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging joined the effort. For 4 days, they combed the forest in grid patterns, covering every trail, drainage, and ridgeline within a 5-mile radius of the disappearance site. The search dogs picked up Claire's scent along the trail, but it abruptly ended on a section of bare rock about 70 yards from where she was last seen. The same thing happened with Mr. Cooper's trail. The dog handlers noted something unusual in their reports. The scents didn't lead off into the woods. They simply stopped on solid stone, as if both people had been lifted straight into the air. No physical evidence was recovered. No torn clothing, no blood, no signs of a struggle. The forest floor was undisturbed. No broken branches, no drag marks. This complete absence of violence became the foundation for a theory that would soon shift the entire investigation from a search for missing persons to a hunt for fugitives. On the 5th day, whispers began circulating through local news outlets and social media. Reporters interviewing students at Jackson Hole High School picked up on something. Several teenagers mentioned that Claire Mitchell and Mr. Cooper seemed to have a special connection. Students said Claire frequently stayed after class to talk with him, sometimes for 20 or 30 minutes. A few claimed they'd seen the two of them laughing together in his classroom when no one else was around. One student described Mr. Cooper as being unusually protective of Claire, always checking in on her during group activities. The police, following up on these rumors, obtained a warrant to search Michael Cooper's classroom and office. In the bottom drawer of his desk, investigators found 3 handwritten letters. The handwriting was confirmed to be Claire's. The letters were carefully folded and tucked inside a manila folder. The content of the letters was personal, but not explicitly romantic. Claire thanked Mr. Cooper for being the only adult who seemed to truly listen to her. She wrote about feeling misunderstood at home and isolated at school. She described him as someone who made her feel like her thoughts mattered. Although there were no overtly sexual or romantic statements, the tone was intimate, vulnerable. To the public and the press, the implication was clear. Within 48 hours, the narrative had solidified. News headlines shifted from "Teacher and Student Missing" to "Did Teacher Flee with Student?" Online forums exploded with speculation. Comment sections filled with accusations. People who had never met Michael Cooper declared him a predator, a manipulator, a man who had used his position of authority to groom a vulnerable teenager. The investigation pivoted. Detectives began analyzing Cooper's financial records, looking for evidence of hidden accounts or large cash withdrawals that might suggest he'd been planning an escape. They reviewed his search history, examined old maps found in his home, and interviewed colleagues, searching for any indication that he'd been plotting this for months. Michael Cooper's wife, Rebecca, was left to face the storm alone. She and their 2 teenage sons were besieged. Their home was vandalized. Someone spray-painted the word "predator" across their garage door in bright red letters. Bricks were thrown through their windows in the middle of the night. Rebecca filed multiple police reports about threatening phone calls and messages. Strangers showed up at their door demanding answers, shouting accusations. Even some of Michael's colleagues, people who'd worked alongside him for years, began distancing themselves. In interviews, a few mentioned they'd noticed Michael giving Claire extra attention. Though none could point to anything concrete, the town had made up its mind. Michael Cooper was guilty. The search in the forest was officially scaled back after 2 weeks. The case was reclassified. No longer missing persons. Now it was a manhunt for 2 fugitives. The assumption was that Michael Cooper and Claire Mitchell were somewhere out there, hiding, waiting for the attention to die down before making their next move. The White River National Forest surrounding Grand Teton grew quiet again, keeping its secrets buried beneath layers of pine needles and stone. 3 months passed in this state of collective certainty. The media moved on to other stories. The volunteers went home. Rebecca Cooper stopped answering her door. And somewhere deep in those mountains, the truth remained hidden, waiting to be uncovered. On January 23, 2018, winter had locked the Tetons in a grip of ice and silence. For the past 3 weeks, temperatures had barely climbed above 15 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and plunged well below zero at night. Heavy snow had blanketed the high country, making most trails impassable. The The park was empty. Tourist season was long over, and even locals avoided venturing too far from plowed roads. Exactly 4 months had passed since Michael Cooper and Claire Mitchell vanished. Officially, hope of finding them alive had been abandoned by late November. That morning, 2 employees of Summit Ridge Construction, a private company contracted to assess potential infrastructure sites for a new communications tower, were working in a remote sector of the forest northwest of Jenny Lake. The area was designated on maps as Sector 12, a rugged stretch of land nearly 14 miles from the nearest maintained road. It was a landscape of steep ridges, hidden valleys, and old mining claims dating back to the early 1900s. The surveyors, whose names later appeared in official reports as key witnesses, had been forced to hike the last 2 miles on foot after their truck couldn't make it up an ice-covered logging road. At approximately 10:45 in the morning, as they were setting up equipment on a flat clearing near the base of a rocky hillside, one of them noticed something unusual. Partially hidden beneath a tangle of deadfall timber and a snowdrift, there was a dark rectangular shape. Metal, weathered and rusted, but clearly man-made. It was a hatch. The hatch was roughly 3 feet by 4 feet, set flush into the ground and covered by what looked like decades of accumulated dirt and debris. But some of the debris looked recent. Branches and logs that hadn't yet rotted, placed deliberately to obscure the metal surface. Guided by professional curiosity and a sense that something wasn't right, the 2 men cleared away the snow and timber. Underneath, they found a heavy steel hatch with a simple latch mechanism. No lock, just a lever. One of the surveyors grabbed it and pulled. The hatch resisted at first, the hinges stiff and corroded, but then it gave way with a deep metallic groan. A rush of cold, stale air escaped from the darkness below. At first, they assumed it was an old mining access point or a forgotten storage bunker. But then they heard something. A faint sound, barely audible, rising up from the black void beneath them. It was rhythmic, metallic, the slow scrape of chain links dragging across concrete. One of the surveyors pulled a high-powered flashlight from his pack and aimed the beam down into the opening. The light cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow ladder bolted to a concrete wall, descending about 12 feet into what appeared to be a small underground room. The floor was concrete. The walls were concrete. And sitting in the far corner, pressed against the wall, was a human figure. A girl. She was sitting on a thin, filthy mattress. Her clothing hung off her frame in tatters, too large for her skeletal body. Her hair was matted and tangled. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and wrapped tightly around her right ankle was a thick industrial chain, the other end bolted into the floor with a heavy steel anchor. The girl's eyes, dull and slow to react, turned toward the light. She raised one hand weakly, shielding her face. The surveyors froze, too shocked to move for several long seconds. Then one of them found his voice. "Are you Claire Mitchell?" The girl nodded, barely. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. She tried again, her voice a dry, cracked whisper. "Water." The surveyors didn't have the tools to break the chain. One of them climbed down the ladder and gave her his jacket and a bottle of water from his pack, while the other immediately grabbed his satellite phone and called for emergency rescue. The call reached the Teton County Sheriff's Office at 10:52. Within minutes, every available unit was mobilized. The first rescue team, including paramedics and a tactical entry unit, reached the site at 1:15 in the afternoon. They had to use a portable angle grinder to cut through the hardened steel links of the chain. The operation took nearly 30 minutes. The sound of the grinder echoed through the small concrete chamber, shrill and violent. When the chain finally gave way with a sharp crack, the paramedics moved in quickly. Claire was placed on a stretcher. She was diagnosed on-site with severe hypothermia, acute dehydration, and extreme malnutrition. Her body weight had dropped to a critical level. Her muscles had atrophied from months of immobility. As they carried her up the ladder and into the daylight for the first time in 4 months, she blinked against the brightness of the snow and sky. One of the sheriff's deputies leaned close to her, speaking gently. "You're safe now, Claire. Can you tell us what happened? Where is Mr. Cooper?" Claire's eyes, hollow and exhausted, focused on the deputy's face. And then she spoke, her voice so quiet and hoarse that the deputy had to lean in even closer to hear. "Did you find him? Please tell me you found Mr. Cooper." Tears began to roll down her dirt-streaked face. "He tried to save me. He fought him. I heard the shots. Please, is he alive?" The words hit like a shockwave. In that moment, every assumption, every accusation, every headline over the past 4 months was shattered. Michael Cooper wasn't a predator. He wasn't a fugitive. He was a victim, and somewhere out there in those mountains, his body was waiting to be found. Claire Mitchell was transported by helicopter to St. John's Medical Center in Jackson. The initial examination conducted by the emergency room team painted a grim picture. Her medical file, portions of which were later submitted as evidence in the criminal case, listed a series of devastating diagnoses: severe dehydration, hypothermia, multiple contusions and abrasions on her extremities, deep lacerations around her ankle where the chain had cut into the skin, some infected, significant muscle atrophy in both legs. Doctors noted that she could not stand without assistance. Her body had been confined for so long that her muscles had begun to waste away. Psychologically, she was in a state of profound shock. She flinched at sudden noises, became agitated when the lights were turned off, and refused to be left alone in the hospital room. A trauma counselor assigned to her case documented that Claire displayed classic symptoms of severe PTSD. For the first 72 hours, doctors strictly prohibited any investigative interviews. But on the 4th day, when her vital signs had stabilized and she was able to speak without severe pain, detectives from the Teton County Sheriff's Office were granted permission to conduct a preliminary interview. The interview took place in a quiet private room at the hospital. 2 detectives were present, along with a victim's advocate and Claire's parents. What Claire described over the next 2 hours would completely dismantle the narrative that had dominated the investigation for months. Her testimony was recorded, transcribed, and later became a central piece of evidence in the case. According to Claire, on that October afternoon on the Jenny Lake Loop Trail, she had indeed stopped briefly. She was adjusting the shoulder strap on her backpack, which had been digging into her skin, when Mr. Cooper came back to check on her. They were standing on a section of trail that curved sharply around a cluster of large boulders and dense undergrowth. It was from that undergrowth that a man appeared. Claire described him as tall, broad-shouldered, dressed head to toe in dark green and brown camouflage hunting gear. His face was partially obscured by a black neck gaiter pulled up over his nose, and he wore a dark baseball cap pulled low. But what she remembered most clearly was the gun. A black semi-automatic pistol, held steady in his gloved hand, pointed directly at Mr. Cooper's chest. The man didn't shout. He didn't make threats. He simply raised one finger to his lips in a gesture of silence, then motioned with the barrel of the gun for them to step off the trail. Mr. Cooper, recognizing the immediate danger and understanding that any sound might provoke violence, obeyed. He positioned himself slightly in front of Claire, shielding her as much as possible. The man forced them to walk deeper into the forest, away from the marked trail. They moved quickly, stepping over logs and pushing through thick brush. Claire estimated they walked for about 25 minutes before the terrain opened up into a narrow ravine. This explained why the search dogs had lost their trail. The scent had been broken when they stepped off the rocky trail surface and into the ravine, where the ground was covered with a thick mat of decomposing pine needles that didn't hold footprints. At the bottom of the ravine, hidden beneath the overhanging branches of several large pines, was a vehicle. An old dark green pickup truck, covered in dried mud and forest debris. It looked like it had been parked there for days, maybe weeks, deliberately camouflaged. The man opened the passenger door and gestured for Claire to get in. That's when Mr. Cooper made his move. He must have realized that once they were in that truck, their chances of survival dropped to nearly zero. So he did the only thing he could. He lunged at the man, trying to grab the gun. Claire saw them struggle. Mr. Cooper managed to get one hand on the man's wrist, trying to force the weapon away. He threw a punch that connected with the side of the man's head. But the man was larger, stronger. The fight lasted only seconds. 2 shots rang out, sharp and deafening in the stillness of the forest. Mr. Cooper staggered backward and collapsed onto the ground. Claire screamed. The man walked over to Mr. Cooper's motionless body, nudged it with his boot, checking for a response. There was none. What happened next was methodical and cold. The man grabbed Claire by the arm, zip-tied her wrists behind her back, and forced her into the truck. Then he went to the truck bed and pulled out a large sheet of heavy-duty tarp. Claire, looking through the rear window of the cab, watched as he wrapped Mr. Cooper's body in the tarp, securing it with lengths of rope and wire. He loaded the body into the truck bed like it was cargo, then covered it with more debris and a second tarp. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove. Claire's eyes were covered with a cloth tied tightly around her head. She couldn't see where they were going. All she could do was feel the motion of the truck as it bounced and lurched over rough terrain. She remembered the sound of gravel, the squeal of old suspension, the smell of oil and gasoline. After what felt like 20 or 30 minutes, the truck stopped. The engine shut off. Claire heard the man get out. She heard his boots crunching on gravel, moving away from the truck. Then she heard another sound, distant but distinct. A low mechanical hum like heavy machinery running continuously. And with it, a sharp chemical smell that made her gag. It was the smell of sulfur, thick and nauseating, seeping into the cab. Minutes passed. Then she heard a loud splash, something heavy hitting water. The sound echoed slightly, the way it does in a confined space or near steep rock walls. More sounds followed. Stones falling, metal clanging, then silence. The man returned to the truck. He drove again, this time for what seemed like an hour. When the truck finally stopped and Claire was pulled out, she was led on foot through dense forest. She stumbled over roots and rocks, unable to see, her hands still bound. Eventually, she felt the ground change beneath her feet. It became flat, hard, concrete. She was pushed down a ladder. When the blindfold was finally removed, she found herself in a small underground room. Concrete walls, concrete floor, a single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and a heavy chain waiting to be locked around her ankle. For the next 4 months, that bunker became her entire world. The man came every few days, always at irregular intervals. He brought water in plastic jugs and canned food. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was in short, clipped sentences. He never told her his name. He never explained why she was there. He simply watched her, sometimes for long stretches, sitting in silence near the ladder, staring at her like she was some kind of exhibit. Claire learned quickly that fighting or pleading only made him angry. So she stayed quiet. She survived. After Claire's testimony, the investigation shifted into high gear. Detectives now had a clear picture of what had happened, but they needed to recover Michael Cooper's body and identify the man responsible. Claire's memory, though fragmented by trauma, provided crucial clues. She remembered the sound of machinery and the smell of sulfur shortly before hearing the splash. Analysts from the Park Service and local geology experts were brought in to review the information. Within a 40-mile radius of the abduction site, there was only one location that fit the description. An area near the Gros Ventre River, where an old abandoned water pumping station still operated on minimal power. The station had been built in the 1950s to service a now-defunct logging operation. The water in that area had a high mineral content, including sulfur compounds, which gave it a distinct rotten egg smell. And just beyond the pump station was a series of old flooded gravel quarries, long abandoned and filled with dark, freezing water. On February 2, 2018, a joint team consisting of sheriff's investigators and a professional dive recovery unit from the Wyoming Search and Rescue Association arrived at the site. The location was desolate. No roads led directly to it. The team had to hike in with their equipment on sleds. The quarry they targeted was roughly circular, about 100 feet across, with steep rock walls dropping straight down into the water. The water was black, stained by sediment and organic material. Ice crusted the edges. Conditions for the dive were brutal. Water temperature was just above freezing. Visibility underwater was less than 2 feet. The divers worked methodically, using sonar equipment to scan the bottom. The quarry was deep, nearly 40 feet at its center. For the first hour, the sonar readings showed only scattered debris, old machinery, rusted metal, submerged logs. Then, at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, one of the dive team leaders signaled from the surface. The sonar had detected an anomaly, an object roughly 6 feet in length, resting on the bottom in a depression beneath a rock overhang. 2 divers descended. The water was so dark that even with powerful dive lights, they could barely see their own hands in front of their faces. They worked by feel as much as by sight. When they reached the object, they confirmed what they'd feared. It was a body, wrapped tightly in a heavy tarp and bound with wire. Large concrete blocks had been tied to the bundle, weighing it down. The divers secured lifting straps around the bundle and signaled the surface team. It took nearly an hour to bring it up. When the tarp was finally cut open on the shore, the identification was immediate. It was Michael Cooper. The cold water had slowed decomposition significantly. The forensic examination conducted on-site confirmed cause of death. 2 gunshot wounds. One to the upper chest, the other to the abdomen. The trajectory and placement of the wounds were consistent with Claire's description of the struggle. But it was Michael's hands that told the real story. Both hands showed severe bruising and lacerations. His knuckles were scraped raw. These were defensive wounds, injuries sustained during a fight. In his final moments, Michael Cooper had fought with everything he had, trying to disarm a man with a gun, knowing full well he was likely going to die, but buying his student precious seconds to survive. The news of the body's recovery was released to the media that evening. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Headlines that had once condemned Michael Cooper now hailed him as a hero. The people who had vandalized his home, who had called him a predator, who had sent death threats to his wife, now flooded social media with apologies and tributes. Flowers and candles began appearing on the front porch of the Cooper home. Strangers left handwritten notes expressing shame and regret. But for Rebecca Cooper and her 2 sons, the damage had already been done. Michael was gone, and no amount of public remorse could bring him back. While the recovery of Michael Cooper's body brought closure to one aspect of the case, it also intensified the hunt for his killer. Forensic teams meticulously examined every piece of physical evidence. The tarp that had been wrapped around Michael's body was sent to the state crime lab. Trace evidence analysts found several critical clues embedded in the fabric. First, there were animal hairs, stiff, short, and dark brown with a reddish tint. DNA analysis confirmed they belonged to a large dog, specifically a cane corso, an Italian breed known for its size, strength, and guarding instincts. This was a rare breed in rural Wyoming. Most people in the area kept working dogs like shepherds or hounds, not exotic guard dogs. Second, forensic examiners recovered a partial fingerprint from a length of wire that had been used to secure the concrete blocks to the body. The print was smudged and incomplete, likely due to the moisture and time spent underwater, but it retained enough ridge detail for comparison analysis. Detectives began cross-referencing leads. They contacted veterinary clinics across 3 counties, searching for records of cane corso ownership. After days of dead ends, a receptionist at Mountain View Veterinary Services in the small town of Moran provided a breakthrough. Their records showed a cane corso named Brutus, brought in 2 years earlier for a mandatory rabies vaccination. The dog had been involved in an incident where it had attacked a delivery driver who had entered the property without permission. The name of the dog's owner in the clinic's files was Owen Daniels. When investigators ran that name through state and federal databases, a detailed profile began to emerge. Owen Daniels, age 46, was a former wildland firefighter employed by the U.S. Forest Service. He had worked in fire suppression and wilderness rescue operations for nearly 20 years. But in 2013, his career ended abruptly. Official records showed he had been dismissed following an incident during a wildfire response in the Grand Teton National Forest. A family of tourists, trapped by rapidly spreading flames in a narrow canyon, had called for emergency evacuation. Owen had been part of the helicopter rescue team dispatched to extract them. But due to a combination of miscommunication and poor weather conditions, the helicopter arrived too late. The family perished. An internal investigation determined that while Owen was not directly at fault, his decision-making during the operation had been questionable. He was placed on administrative leave and eventually resigned under pressure. Colleagues who were interviewed during that investigation noted that Owen had become increasingly withdrawn and erratic in the months following the tragedy. He stopped socializing. He missed meetings. He talked obsessively about how modern people were unprepared for nature, how they ventured into the wilderness with no real understanding of its dangers. After leaving the Forest Service, Owen Daniels disappeared from public life. He stopped filing tax returns. He had no registered employment. He ceased all contact with former coworkers and friends. Property records showed that he owned a parcel of land inherited from his father, located in an extremely remote area north of the small community of Taguati Pass. The land was miles from the nearest maintained road, accessible only by a rough, overgrown logging track. When investigators pulled satellite imagery of the property, they saw a scene that looked more like a junkyard than a home. An old travel trailer sat in the center of a clearing, surrounded by piles of scrap metal, stacks of firewood, rusted vehicle frames, and tarps covering unidentifiable objects. This location was positioned almost perfectly between three key sites: the trail where Claire and Michael had been abducted, the flooded quarry where Michael's body had been dumped, and the hidden bunker where Claire had been held. Each site was roughly 10 to 15 miles away via old logging roads and Forest Service tracks. Owen knew this area intimately. He had spent 2 decades working in these mountains, fighting fires, conducting rescues, learning every trail, every access point, every hidden corner. If anyone could move through this wilderness without leaving a trace, it was him. Now the question was no longer who, but how to apprehend him. Owen Daniels was armed, highly trained in wilderness survival, and living in complete isolation. A direct approach could easily turn into a deadly confrontation or allow him to vanish into the forest, where finding him would be nearly impossible. At the end of February 2018, the Teton County Sheriff's Office, in coordination with the FBI's Regional Field Office, initiated a covert surveillance operation. The decision was made to observe Owen Daniels from a distance before attempting an arrest. The goal was to confirm his presence, assess his behavior, and gather enough intelligence to plan a tactical approach that minimized risk. A specialized surveillance team, composed of officers trained in wilderness reconnaissance, was deployed. They established an observation post on a forested ridge approximately half a mile from Owen's property. The position offered a clear line of sight to the trailer and the surrounding clearing, while keeping the team concealed among the trees. The conditions were harsh. Daytime temperatures hovered in the low 20s. At night, they dropped below zero. The team operated in shifts, using high-powered optics and thermal imaging cameras to monitor the site around the clock. The first confirmation came within hours. A large dog was spotted moving freely around the property. Through binoculars, the team could clearly identify the breed. Cane Corso, muscular build, dark coat, characteristic square head. The dog was not on a leash or chain. It patrolled the perimeter of the clearing, moving with the alert confidence of an animal trained to guard. It would pause frequently, ears up, scanning the tree line. At one point, the dog stopped and stared directly toward the ridge where the surveillance team was hidden, as if it sensed something. The team remained motionless, knowing that any movement or noise could give away their position. The next morning, Owen Daniels himself appeared. He stepped out of the trailer just after dawn, carrying a steaming mug in one hand and a pump-action shotgun in the other. He never set the gun down. He stood on the small wooden deck outside the trailer door for several minutes, slowly scanning the forest, his eyes moving methodically from left to right. His body language was tense, wary. This was not a man casually enjoying his morning coffee. This was someone who expected trouble. Later that day, the surveillance team observed Owen working near an old shed at the edge of the clearing. Partially covered by a tarp was a vehicle. When the wind shifted and the tarp lifted slightly, the team got a clear view. It was a dark green pickup truck, heavily weathered, covered in mud and forest debris. The description matched Claire's recollection perfectly. Through telephoto lenses, the team could see a dent in the rear bumper and the faded remnants of a sticker that had been partially scraped off. It was the same truck. The observation continued for 2 more days. Owen's routine was erratic. He didn't follow any predictable schedule. Sometimes he stayed inside the trailer for hours. Other times he emerged suddenly and worked outside, chopping wood, moving objects, or simply standing still watching the forest. On the evening of the 2nd day, something changed. At approximately 6:15, as the light was fading, Owen came out of the trailer carrying several large black trash bags. He walked over to a rusted metal barrel that he used as a burn pit and began emptying the bags into it. The team, watching through high-powered optics, could see what he was throwing into the fire. Clothing, shoes, papers, books. He doused the contents with what looked like lighter fluid and set it ablaze. The flames roared up, bright orange against the darkening sky. Owen stood there, silhouetted against the fire, watching everything burn. The lead investigator monitoring the operation from a command post several miles away made the call. Owen Daniels was destroying evidence. If they waited any longer, critical physical evidence linking him to the crimes could be lost forever. Worse, his behavior suggested he might be preparing to flee. If he disappeared into the backcountry with a head start, they might never find him. The decision was made. The tactical arrest operation would be executed at dawn the following morning. On March 4, 2018, at 4:45 in the morning, a tactical response team consisting of 12 officers from the Teton County Sheriff's Office and FBI Regional SWAT personnel moved into position. The plan was to approach under cover of darkness, using night vision equipment to navigate the forest without lights. The goal was to establish a perimeter around the property, then initiate contact once all exits were secured. The team moved in silence, their boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. Within 30 minutes, they had surrounded the clearing. 4 officers positioned themselves along the logging road, cutting off the only vehicle escape route. The rest formed a loose ring around the trailer, staying concealed in the tree line. At 5:15, the order was given to move in. But before the team could advance, the dog reacted. Brutus, the cane corso, was sleeping on the trailer's small deck. His ears suddenly perked up. He lifted his head, nostrils flaring. Then he stood, body rigid, staring directly toward the section of forest where 3 officers were crouched behind a fallen log. The dog began barking, deep and aggressive. Within seconds, a light inside the trailer flicked on. The tactical team had lost the element of surprise. The lead officer, using a handheld loudspeaker, made the announcement. "Owen Daniels, this is the Teton County Sheriff's Office. We have a warrant for your arrest. Come out of the trailer with your hands up." For a moment, there was no response. Then the trailer's door flew open, and Owen Daniels appeared. But he wasn't surrendering. He was holding a rifle, an AR-15 style semi-automatic. Before anyone could react, he raised the weapon and opened fire. The first shots tore through the thin metal walls of the trailer, exiting out the sides and back. Officers dropped to the ground, scrambling for cover behind trees and equipment. Owen fired wildly, not aiming at specific targets, but sweeping the weapon back and forth in controlled bursts. Bullets snapped through branches overhead and thudded into tree trunks. The dog, Brutus, launched off the deck and charged toward the nearest officers. The team's designated animal handler had been prepared for this. He fired a single tranquilizer dart from an air rifle. The dart struck the dog in the shoulder. Brutus yelped, stumbled mid-stride, and collapsed heavily into the snow 20 feet from the trailer. His legs twitched once, then went still. Owen saw his dog fall. For a brief moment, he stopped firing and stared at the motionless animal. Then he ducked back inside the trailer. The team commander, positioned behind an armored vehicle that had been brought in overnight, grabbed the loudspeaker again. "Owen, you're surrounded. There's no way out. Put down the weapon and come out with your hands visible." The response was another burst of gunfire, this time aimed more deliberately. Owen had moved to a window on the opposite side of the trailer and was firing toward the officers blocking the logging road. One round struck the hood of a sheriff's vehicle, punching a hole through the metal. The situation was rapidly escalating. The tactical team couldn't maintain a standoff indefinitely. Owen had cover, supplies, and enough ammunition to keep them pinned down for hours. The decision was made to use less lethal force to end the confrontation. 2 officers, equipped with ballistic shields, moved forward in a low crouch until they were within throwing range of the trailer. On the commander's signal, they hurled flashbang grenades through 2 of the broken windows. The devices detonated simultaneously with a deafening bang and a blinding white flash. The concussive force rattled the trailer on its frame. Inside, Owen was disoriented. His vision washed out. His hearing reduced to a high-pitched ringing. The entry team moved fast. They breached the front door with a hydraulic ram, the door flying inward and slamming against the interior wall. 3 officers stormed inside, weapons raised, shouting commands. Owen was on the floor near the back of the trailer, trying to reach for his rifle, which had fallen during the flashbang blast. Before his hand could touch the weapon, an officer kicked it away. Another officer tackled Owen to the ground, driving a knee into his back. Owen fought, thrashing and trying to throw off the weight, but within seconds his arms were wrenched behind his back and secured with heavy-duty flex cuffs. He was pulled to his feet and dragged outside. Blood was running from his nose, and his eyes were unfocused, still reeling from the effects of the flashbangs. But he wasn't silent. As the officers hauled him toward a waiting vehicle, he began to laugh. It was a low, rasping sound, more unsettling than any scream. He looked at the officers surrounding him, his face twisted into something between a grin and a grimace, and he said, "You don't understand. I saved her. I saved her from all of you." Once Owen was secured in the back of an armored transport vehicle, the forensic team moved in to process the scene. Inside the trailer, the conditions were appalling. The interior was filthy, cluttered with piles of unwashed clothing, empty cans, and stacks of old newspapers. The walls were covered with maps, topographic maps of the Teton Range, marked with red pen. Some areas were circled. Others had dates written next to them. The forensic team photographed everything. In the small sleeping area at the back of the trailer, investigators found a loose floorboard. Underneath was a hidden compartment, crudely constructed but effective. Inside the compartment were several items that would become key pieces of evidence. First, a dark blue backpack with the Jackson Hole High School logo embroidered on the front. It was Claire Mitchell's. Inside were her school notebooks, a water bottle, and a jacket. Second, a wristwatch, a men's Timex with a worn leather band. Engraved on the back were the words, "To Michael with all my love, Rebecca, 2009. It was the watch Michael Cooper had been wearing the day he disappeared. Owen had taken it from Michael's wrist after killing him, keeping it as a trophy. Third, wrapped carefully in an oil-stained cloth, was a handgun, a Glock 19 9mm. A ballistics expert examined the weapon on site and confirmed that the rifling pattern in the barrel was consistent with the bullets recovered from Michael Cooper's body during the autopsy. But the most disturbing discovery was still pinned to the wall. One of the maps had additional markings that didn't correspond to the known crime scenes. There were 2 other locations circled in red, each with a date written beside it. July 2014, September 2016. These were areas deep in the backcountry, miles from any established trail. The coordinates were noted in Owen's handwriting. The investigative team immediately cross-referenced these dates and locations with missing persons reports. In July 2014, a 26-year-old solo hiker named Ethan Rivera had disappeared while backpacking in the northern section of the Grand Teton National Forest. His car had been found at a trailhead, but no trace of him was ever recovered. In September 2016, a 31-year-old woman named Morgan Hayes, an experienced climber, had vanished during a solo trip near the Wind River Range. Despite extensive searches, her body was never found. Now, those names had locations. Owen Daniels hadn't just abducted Claire Mitchell. He had been operating for years. Owen Daniels was transported under heavy security to the Teton County Detention Center in Jackson. He was placed in an isolated cell under 24-hour surveillance. For the first 48 hours, he refused to speak to anyone. He sat on the edge of the cot in his cell, staring at the wall, occasionally muttering to himself. When investigators attempted to question him, he would either ignore them completely or respond with cryptic, disjointed statements. They were weak. They didn't understand. The forest teaches. The forest purifies. On the third day, Owen's demeanor shifted. He requested to speak with the lead investigator, Detective Sarah Brennan, who had been overseeing the case since Claire's discovery. The interrogation was conducted in a secure interview room, with Owen shackled to a steel ring bolted into the floor. 2 additional officers stood guard outside the door. Detective Brennan sat across from him, a digital recorder running on the table between them. "Owen, I need you to help me understand what happened," Brennan began, her voice calm and measured. "Why did you take Claire Mitchell and Michael Cooper?" Owen looked at her for a long moment, his eyes sharp and focused for the first time in days. Then he began to speak. His voice was steady, almost eerily calm, as if he were explaining something obvious to a child who simply didn't grasp the concept. "You're asking the wrong question," he said. "I didn't take them. I removed them from danger. There's a difference." Brennan leaned forward slightly. "What danger?" Owen's jaw tightened. "The world, society, all of it. Look around you, detective. People walk into the wilderness with their phones, their GPS devices, their false sense of security. They think nature is a theme park. They don't respect it. They don't understand it. And when it turns on them, they die, screaming and confused, because no one ever taught them how to survive." He paused, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "I spent 20 years saving people like that, pulling them out of fires, carrying them off mountains. And you know what I realized? It doesn't matter. They go right back to their comfortable, weak lives. They learn nothing." Brennan kept her expression neutral. "So you decided to teach them?" Owen nodded slowly. "Not teach, preserve. There are some people, rare people, who have the potential. I could see it in them. The girl, Claire. She was quiet, observant, not like the others, laughing and shouting and disturbing the forest. She had something pure. If I left her out there, the world would have crushed that. So I saved her." "And Michael Cooper?" Brennan asked. "What about him?" Owen's face darkened. He didn't understand. "I tried to make him see. I told him, I'm not going to hurt her. I'm protecting her. But he fought me. He was just like the rest of them, controlled by fear and panic instead of logic. He left me no choice." Brennan let the silence hang for a moment. "You shot him twice. He was unarmed." Owen's expression didn't change. "He attacked me. I defended myself. And then you wrapped his body in a tarp, tied concrete blocks to it, and dumped it in a quarry." Owen shrugged. "I had to dispose of the evidence. That's just practical." Detective Brennan opened a folder on the table and pulled out 2 photographs. They were printouts of the map that had been found in Owen's trailer, showing the 2 additional marked locations. She slid them across the table. "What about these, Owen? July 2014, September 2016. What happened at these locations?" Owen stared at the photographs for a long time. Then, to Brennan's surprise, he smiled. "You found the map. I wondered if you would." "Tell me about them," Brennan said. Owen leaned back in his chair as much as the restraints would allow. "Ethan Rivera. He was a software developer from Denver. Came out here to find himself by hiking alone for a week. I watched him for 2 days. He was careless, loud, left trash on the trail. But he was young and strong. I thought maybe I could train him, so I brought him to one of my places, an old fire lookout tower that had been decommissioned. I gave him food, water, basic supplies. I tried to teach him how to live without all the modern distractions. But he wouldn't listen. He kept screaming, trying to break free. After 3 weeks, he stopped eating, just gave up. His body couldn't handle it." Brennan's stomach turned, but she kept her voice steady. "And Morgan Hayes?" "Morgan was different," Owen said, his tone almost wistful. She was strong. Climber. Real skills. I thought she'd last. I kept her in a cave system near the Wind River Range. I even let her move around, no chains, because I thought she understood. But one night she tried to run. She made it almost 2 miles before I caught her. She fought me, tried to take my knife. I had to stop her. He paused. She fell during the struggle, hit her head on a rock. It was an accident. Brennan felt a wave of cold anger but forced herself to stay composed. Where are their bodies, Owen? Buried. Deep. The forest takes care of its own. The interrogation continued for another hour. Owen Daniels confessed to the kidnapping of Claire Mitchell, the murder of Michael Cooper, and the deaths of Ethan Rivera and Morgan Hayes. His words were recorded, transcribed, and later used as evidence in court. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't the brutality of his actions. It was his complete lack of remorse. To Owen Daniels, he wasn't a killer. He was a savior. And in his fractured mind, the world had failed to understand his mission. On September 12, 2018, the trial of Owen Daniels began in the Teton County District Court in Jackson, Wyoming. The case had drawn national media attention. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse. Reporters jostled for position on the front steps, broadcasting live updates. Security inside the building was unprecedented. Metal detectors were set up at every entrance. Armed deputies stood at attention in the hallways. The courtroom itself was packed. Every seat in the public gallery was filled. Family members of the victims sat in the front rows. Rebecca Cooper, Michael's widow, was there with her 2 sons, all 3 dressed in black. Claire Mitchell sat beside her parents, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had regained some weight since her rescue, but she still looked fragile, her face pale and drawn. Owen Daniels was brought into the courtroom in full restraints. His hands were cuffed in front of him, connected by a chain to a belt around his waist. His ankles were shackled, forcing him to shuffle slowly as he walked. He was dressed in a plain gray jumpsuit. His hair had been cut short, and his beard trimmed, but his eyes still held that same unsettling intensity. He sat at the defense table, flanked by his court-appointed attorneys, and stared straight ahead, his face expressionless. The charges were read aloud by the prosecutor, a veteran attorney named David Walsh, who had handled some of the most serious cases in Wyoming's history. The list was long. First-degree murder in the death of Michael Cooper. Kidnapping and false imprisonment of Claire Mitchell. 2 counts of second-degree murder in the deaths of Ethan Rivera and Morgan Hayes. Unlawful possession of a firearm by a prohibited person. Assault on law enforcement officers. Each charge carried severe penalties. If convicted on all counts, Owen Daniels would spend the rest of his life in prison, with the possibility of the death penalty for the murder of Michael Cooper. The trial proceeded methodically. The prosecution called witness after witness. Park rangers who had participated in the initial search testified about the complete absence of evidence. The strange way the scent trails had simply disappeared. Students from Jackson Hole High School took the stand, recounting the day of the disappearance. One student broke down in tears while describing how Mr. Cooper had always been kind, always patient, and how the rumors had been unbearable. Rebecca Cooper testified about the harassment her family had endured, the vandalism, the threats, and the unimaginable pain of losing her husband while the world believed he was a criminal. Her voice was steady, but tears streamed down her face as she spoke. The most anticipated testimony came from Claire Mitchell herself. The courtroom fell completely silent as she walked slowly to the witness stand. She placed her hand on the Bible, took the oath, and sat down. Prosecutor Walsh approached gently. "Claire, I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell the court, in your own words, what happened on October 15, 2017. Claire took a deep breath. Her voice was quiet at first, but it grew stronger as she spoke. She described the moment the man appeared on the trail. The gun. Mr. Cooper's attempt to shield her. The forced march through the forest. The fight. The gunshots. Her voice cracked when she described seeing Mr. Cooper fall. "I knew he was dead," she said, her hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. But he did it to give me a chance. He didn't hesitate. He just stepped forward. She described the months in the bunker, the cold, the darkness, the isolation, the terror of not knowing if anyone would ever find her. And she described Owen's visits. He would just sit there and stare at me, like I wasn't a person, like I was something he owned. When Walsh finished his questions, the defense attorney rose to cross-examine. But Claire looked directly at Owen Daniels and said, before any question could be asked, "You didn't save me, you destroyed me, and you murdered a man who was worth 1,000 of you." The defense's strategy was to argue that Owen Daniels was mentally ill, that his actions were the result of severe PTSD and delusional thinking stemming from the trauma of the 2013 wildfire incident. Psychologists testified about his deteriorating mental state after losing his job. They described how trauma can fracture a person's perception of reality. But the prosecution countered with their own experts, who testified that while Owen may have suffered from trauma, he was fully aware of his actions. He had planned meticulously. He had concealed evidence. He had lied to investigators. These were not the actions of someone incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. The most damning moment came when the prosecution played the video recording of Owen's interrogation. The entire courtroom watched as Owen calmly described his philosophy. "I didn't kidnap her. I removed her from danger." The jury watched his face, his tone, his complete lack of remorse. When the video ended, several jurors were visibly shaken. The trial lasted 3 weeks. On October 4, 2018, the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before reaching a verdict. When they returned to the courtroom, the forewoman stood and read the decision. Guilty on all counts. Owen Daniels showed no reaction. He simply stared straight ahead, his expression blank. The judge, a stern woman in her early 60s named Margaret Holloway, scheduled the sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later. On October 18th, Judge Holloway delivered the sentence. For the murder of Michael Cooper, life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the kidnapping of Claire Mitchell, an additional 25 years. For the deaths of Ethan Rivera and Morgan Hayes, 2 consecutive life sentences. Owen Daniels would never see freedom again. As the bailiffs moved to escort him out of the courtroom, Owen turned and looked directly at Claire Mitchell. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but Claire stood up, met his gaze, and shook her head. She didn't need to hear anything he had to say. He had no power over her anymore. In the weeks following the trial, the town of Jackson and the surrounding communities tried to come to terms with what had happened. Vigils were held. Memorials were organized. But the weight of collective guilt hung heavy. So many people had been so quick to believe the worst about Michael Cooper. So quick to condemn him without evidence. So eager to participate in the public shaming of an innocent man. On November 10, 2018, Jackson Hole High School organized a memorial service in honor of Michael Cooper. The school gymnasium was transformed. The basketball hoops were draped with black fabric. Rows of chairs filled the floor. At the front of the room, a large photograph of Michael stood on an easel, surrounded by flowers and candles. The service was open to the public, and the turnout was overwhelming. The gym was filled beyond capacity. People stood along the walls and in the doorways. Teachers, students, parents, and townspeople who had never even met Michael came to pay their respects. Rebecca Cooper sat in the front row with her sons. She wore a simple black dress and held a folded American flag that had been presented to her at Michael's funeral. The principal of Jackson Hole High School spoke first, his voice heavy with emotion. Michael Cooper dedicated 15 years of his life to this school. He believed in his students. He believed in the power of education to change lives. And when faced with unimaginable danger, he made the ultimate sacrifice. One of Michael's colleagues, a fellow history teacher named Karen Ellis, took the podium next. Michael was the kind of teacher who stayed late to help students who were struggling, who came in early to set up lessons, who cared deeply not just about grades but about who his students were as people. The rumors that spread about him were vicious and unfounded. And we, as a community, failed him. We failed to give him the benefit of the doubt. We failed to remember that he had spent his entire career earning our trust. And for that, we owe his family an apology that words can never fully express. Then Claire Mitchell stood. She walked slowly to the front of the room, leaning lightly on a cane. Her leg had healed, but the muscles were still weak. She stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then she began. Mr. Cooper was my history teacher. But he was more than that. He was the first adult who made me feel like my thoughts mattered. Like my questions weren't stupid. Like I had something valuable to contribute. I wasn't the most popular kid in school. I didn't have a lot of friends. But when I stayed after class to talk with Mr. Cooper about something we'd learned, he never made me feel like I was wasting his time. He made me feel seen. Her voice grew stronger. When that man pointed a gun at us on the trail, Mr. Cooper didn't hesitate. He didn't think about himself. He thought about me. He stepped between me and the gun. And when that man tried to force us into the truck, Mr. Cooper fought. He knew he was probably going to die. But he fought anyway because he believed that if he could buy me even a few seconds, it might make a difference. And it did. It saved my life. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. The world believed terrible things about him. People said he was a predator, that he had manipulated me, that he had run away with me, and none of it was true. None of it. Mr. Cooper was a hero, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure people remember that. The room was silent except for the sound of quiet crying. Rebecca Cooper stood and walked to the front. She embraced Claire, holding her tightly. The two of them stood there together, united in grief and gratitude. The service continued with more speeches, readings, and a slideshow of photographs showing Michael throughout his years at the school. At the end, a plaque was unveiled. It would be mounted permanently in the school's main hallway. The inscription read, "In memory of Michael Cooper, teacher, protector, hero. His courage and sacrifice will never be forgotten." As people filed out of the gymnasium, many stopped to speak with Rebecca and her sons, offering condolences and apologies. Some left flowers at the base of Michael's photograph. Others simply stood in silence, paying their respects. Outside, the November air was cold and crisp. The mountains in the distance stood tall and silent, their peaks dusted with early snow. Somewhere out there, in those vast, wild spaces, 2 other victims still lay buried. In the weeks following the memorial, search teams were dispatched to the locations marked on Owen Daniels' map. In mid-November, the remains of Ethan Rivera were recovered from a shallow grave near an abandoned fire lookout tower. In early December, Morgan Hayes' body was found in a remote cave system, partially buried under rocks. Both families, who had spent years not knowing what had happened to their loved ones, were finally able to lay them to rest. Claire Mitchell continued her recovery, both physical and psychological. She worked with therapists to process the trauma. She returned to school, completing her final year and graduating with honors. She gave several interviews to news outlets, not to relive her ordeal, but to talk about Michael Cooper, to make sure the world knew the truth. Owen Daniels remained in the Wyoming State Penitentiary, housed in a maximum security unit. He was kept in isolation, away from the general prison population, for his own safety. Prison records noted that he rarely spoke to guards or other inmates. He spent most of his time staring at the wall of his cell, lost in whatever fractured version of reality still existed in his mind. And somewhere, deep in the Teton wilderness, the forest stood silent. The trails remained open. Hikers still ventured into those mountains, seeking beauty, adventure, and solitude. But for those who knew the story, the forest would always carry a shadow. A reminder that nature, for all its majesty, is indifferent, and that true evil doesn't always announce itself with a roar. Sometimes it wears camouflage and moves silently through the trees, watching, waiting, hiding in plain sight. Thanks for watching until the end. It really means a lot. If this story caught your attention, don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what stood out to you most. And of course, make sure to subscribe to Seek Stories and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. See you soon.